any given system you make is going to have, you know, costs and benefits, right? And so a question to ask is, how is it used positively versus how is it used negatively, and which outweighs the other, right? So an easy example of this is the bait ping. The bait ping, every once in a while, would be used positively. There was legitimately people who would use the bait ping to tell their allies to bait the enemy, right? Like, that's what it was originally intended for, and there were some people who would use it for that purpose. Overwhelmingly, the bait ping was used to have people tell them to... The bait ping was used to tell your teammates to keep yourself safe, right? And so that was what it was overwhelmingly used for. And so in that case, when we were removing the bait ping, legitimately there would people come and say, like, why are you removing the bait ping? It's fine. People use it positively sometimes. And it's like, yes, but overwhelmingly it was used in a negative setting. And so that's a case where even if something has positive outcomes, the negative outcomes outweigh the positive outcomes so high that it wasn't worth keeping around. It had, you know, essentially become something to flame your teammates with. And so that's something you often think about with systems, is just like, okay, what is the good versus the bad? And so as an example of something like seeing your teammates in champion select in terms of who they are, there is good there. There is good in terms of like, hey, I can see if this person's on a 20-game loss streak going 0-50 and then dodge them. Like, you know, that's a good outcome. But then how often does that happen compared to something like, hey, I saw this player only has a 45% win rate with Lulu, and I don't think they should pick Lulu in that case, and I'm going to flame them for it, right? And what we were finding is that a lot of those negative interactions were happening with champion select, like looking people up in champion select, are happening a lot more frequently than the case where you look someone up and discover that they're a real inter and need to be dodged, right? And so a lot of these situations you get with, you know, player moderation in the game in general, it's a question of cost versus benefits. And there's any decision you make in game design often will have some costs, even if the benefits are there. And you have to make the decision of whether the costs outweigh the benefits or the benefits outweigh the costs. What do you think would happen if League was a paid game? So the first thing that would happen is it would die. That's the very first thing that would happen. So you actually saw this years ago with a game called Heroes of Newerth. Heroes of Newerth was kind of like the next Dota before Dota 2 came out. And originally it had a very big and vibrant community when it was free to play in beta. But then the decision the devs made when they released the game was to charge for it. But the problem was none of their competition was charging. They were charging for a game in a world where most of the people were playing Dota, a free mod, and then eventually Dota 2, a free game on Steam, or League of Legends, a free game. And so in a market where everybody else is free, when you start charging for something, to some degree you are already dooming your game. So that's one thing to consider, is the market. This is, I think, one of the many knocks against the game Concord that recently came out, is Concord was charging $40 for a game that was in a market where everything was already free. And so that's a pretty rough thing to do just for starters, is when you are charging more than your competition, that's going to cause a lot of people to stop playing. The second thing I think to think about, like if League of Legends went charged, is, excuse me, I think we're going to sell this fish actually. Yeah, let's sell that fish, get some big money on the fish. If League of Legends went charged, I think it would die for other reasons. Very specifically, competitive multiplayer games, assuming they pop off, which is a big if, by the way, that's a big assumption. A lot of competitive multiplayer games that you make will not pop off, but assuming they pop off, assuming a competitive multiplayer game pops off, competitive multiplayer games, assuming they pop off, gain massive, massive benefits from being free to play. Because if a game is free to play, it's really easy to convince your friends to play. Because you'll be like, yo, dude, play this game. And they'll be like, I don't know. And you'll be like, it's free. And they'll be like, oh. Like, basically, it's super easy to peer pressure people into playing a competitive multiplayer game that's free because they can't just say, oh, I can't buy it because it's free, right? All they have to do is click the game and install it, right? So it's actually a huge competitive advantage in terms of acquiring players for a competitive multiplayer game to be free, assuming it pops off. The catch with a competitive multiplayer game being free, the negative, is that if it doesn't pop off, you won't make any money from the people who play it. Sorry, I shouldn't say any, but you'll make way less money from the people who play it, and you might not get your investment back. And so if a game is going to be smaller, there's a lot of legitimate reasons to charge for a game. But just noting that, like, if you do end up getting a big community, your community will be significantly bigger by making it free to play because of all the network effects that you gain from just making it really easy for players to tell their friends, hey, the game's free, you should try it out. And so, yeah, competitive multiplayer games being free to play is generally a win for those. And then the second note is like, well, hey, why would you want a competitive multiplayer game to have lots of players, even if they aren't paying? Because in a free-to-play game, remember, the majority of players aren't going to spend money on your game. And so, from a business perspective, some people might say, well, like, is that okay that you have a bunch of players who aren't spending money on your game? And the answer is yes, it's incredibly okay. Like, that's totally fine. Because every person who plays your game is adding incredible value to the game because they've created a bigger and more vibrant player base. And that means things like just network effects of like, well, if a lot of people are playing your game, they're going to convince other people to play it. That's a huge win, just for starters. But then also things like the more people that play your game, the better the matchmaking is going to be. That's a huge win, right? The more people that play your game, the shorter the queue times are going to be. That's a huge win. The more people that play your game, the more people are going to be making content for your game. That's a huge win. And so sometimes people have this thought that, like, if someone is playing a game and, you know, not paying for it for whatever reason, that's a loss. And I think that thought is, like, completely ridiculous. I think every single person who plays your game, regardless of whether or not they buy skins or anything for it, is, you know, at a baseline, a huge win for your game. And, you know, they can be a loss if they do things like treat people terribly. Like, you don't want people in your game treating people like trash. That's terrible, right? But every single person who plays League of Legends, whether or not they're buying skins, is awesome. Like, we love having those players. Like, and so sometimes people come in here and they'll be like, hey, I play League, but I don't buy any skins. And I'm like, that's totally fine. Like, awesome. Thank you for playing League. Like, a lot of the work we do is to just make League a fun game to play, regardless of whether someone buys skins for it. Because if League's a fun game to play, then at the end of the day, everybody in the community wins. And if League has a bigger player base and a more vibrant player base, at the end of the day, everybody in the community wins. And so it's great to have players who just play the game for funsies. That's totally fine. Like, when we were making Swarm, one of the explicit goals of Swarm was just make something cool for people. And the idea was just like, hey, people like playing League of Legends. Let's make a game mode to reward people who like playing our game. Let's just make a game mode that people can go play and have a good time. There was no goals about monetization with Swarm. There was no goals about trying to, like, extract value from players. The entire goal of Swarm was make something that is fun to play, so that if you like playing League of Legends, you have more fun stuff to do. And I think a lot of people ended up really enjoying it, and that's cool.